Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to ask everybody to know that we are recording the proceedings of this seminar, which will then be later made available to everybody on the ISER YouTube channel. My name is Nhlanhla Cyril Mbata. I'm the host for the webinar this afternoon. Thank you for making the time to join the ISER webinar for one of the most important research and policy discussions around property rights of different varieties of sunflower plants. For South Africa, this is an important discussion as it touches on elements of market structure in this industry. It also touches on decisions to invest in innovations as affected by the level of protection of intellectual rights for such important crops. I think that lessons from this industry might be useful for other industries in many ways that other researchers can also imagine. The ISER is the Institute of Social and Economic Research at Rhodes University. And currently the ISER conducts research in the following areas, which I'll put on your screen just now. I'm not sure if everybody can see my screen. Okay, fantastic. So those are really the areas of research that we are looking at the ISER currently: environmental resources management, research on in the informal sector, as well as education and skills development. And in that particular research theme, we have partnered with the HSRC. We also look at research on African trade, including AGOA and, of course, the new Continental Africa Trade Agreement. We also look at developmental issues such as the initiating big research on local municipalities. We welcome collaborations in all of these areas, and I've put in there an email address that you can reach us at. Okay, I'm now trying to go back to my screen. In any case, today's discussion, we are pleased to have two co-presenters, Dr. Nemachena and Dr. Muchara, in our second 2020 ISER webinar series. And as indicated earlier, the presenters will discuss the changing structure of the sunflower plant breeders' rights landscape in South Africa. And in this study, longitudinal data over decades is used to look at the process and outcomes of applications for the registrations of sunflower plant varieties and the protection that the registrations provide to producers' revenues. I think to encourage entry into this industry and similar others, the protection of revenues is key. So let me introduce to you our presenters. Dr. Muchara is a senior lecturer at the School of Business Leadership at UNISA. He holds a PhD in agricultural economics from UKZN. His research interests are in water resources economics, agribusiness and value chain analysis, as well as water governance. He's currently the leader of one of the WRC's projects on water use in food value chains of indigenous crops, with special focus on production and post-harvest handling of food products. He has written on topics including the following: a contribution to a book titled Institutional Constraints to Smallholder Development in Southern Africa, Wageningen Academic Press. And he's also been a part of a study looking at how Mbongolwane wetlands natural resources can benefit society. Dr. Nemachena is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Finance and Economics at the Graduate School of Business Leadership at UNISA. Her main research interests are biological innovations, intellectual property rights systems in crop production, the economics of agricultural research, agricultural productivity, agricultural policy in general. She holds a PhD in agricultural economics, MSc and BC also in the same field. She has published close to 10 articles in peer-reviewed journals as author and co-author. And we're also pleased to have the generosity of our respondent, Professor Aliba. Michael Aliba is a professor of agricultural economics and extension at the University of Fort Hare. Prior to joining the University of Fort Hare, Michael was a policy analyst with the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, a senior researcher with the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at UWC, and a research director at the Human Sciences Research Council. Michael's main areas of interest include land reform, smallholder development, food security, and rural development. Some of the ground rules for everybody that I would just like to mention very briefly. The presenters will use about 25 minutes to co-present the study. And then this will be followed by the response from Prof. Aliba, which will take, say, about 10 minutes. This will then be followed by discussion time with questions and comments from everybody in the audience. Throughout both presentations and the response, please write down your questions on the Q&A box on your screens. Please do not use the comments for the questions, but rather the box, the Q&A box. And depending on the number of questions that we will be receiving, I will either read out the questions or ask the person who has asked the question from the audience to read out the questions themselves if we don't have too many questions. Also, if the written questions are not clear to me or to the presenters, I will also like the audience member who asked the question to clarify the question through audio. Then the discussion with comments, questions, and answers will take us to the end of the webinar, which we plan not to be more than an hour and a half hours. On that note, over to Dr. Muchara and Dr. Nemachena. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Mbata. May I request Dr. Nemachena to post the presentation so that I can do the background? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Prof. Mbata, for organizing this event, and thank you, colleagues who have taken part in making sure this webinar go ahead. And thank you, my Prof. Aliba, for agreeing to share your scholarliness with on our paper. We are going to engage the group in terms of discussing the evolving sunflower plant breeders' rights in South Africa. So the plant breeders' rights, they actually evolve over time, but these are very critical. This is a very critical aspect that needs to be investigated. And Dr. Nemachena, as Prof. Mbata has introduced, she has taken her time to actually look at this important research, starting from when she was doing her PhD. She has actually looked at looking at wheat varietal benefits, addressing the problem of estimating the benefits derived from wheat varietal improvements. So she has looked at a number of crops. Wheat is one of them, and now she has looked at sunflower. And the intention is actually to also cover some of those underutilized or neglected crops so that we actually understand what's happening within the plant breeders' rights. And maybe some of the delegates might ask ourselves, why actually looking at the plant breeders' rights? What's the importance of that? you realize that if plant breeders' rights are not well protected and there is no value that is derived from actually breeding, from the investment that goes into breeding, it has an impact in terms of the willingness of the investors into pumping money into that sector. And that automatically will end up affecting the entire value chain of whatever crop that we'll be looking at. So in terms of the importance of securing plant breeders' rights, you realize that if investors, be they private or public, are not deriving the benefits from the value chain, from the breeding of those crops, then dwindling investment in those sectors might end up then affecting production. We end up like recycling all the old varieties which might not derive much benefits. And sunflower, in this case, it's very, very important because sunflower it's a crop that is very resilient to drought. So it's actually a conducive crop, especially for most of Southern Africa, which is drought stricken because of climate change issues. So it's actually a strategic crop. It touches on a number of value chains in terms of cooking oil, in terms of pharmaceuticals, in terms of all the animal feed. So it's a key crop that if we invest properly in it, then we are actually, as an economy, we can actually contribute more in that economy. But as you will see, as Dr. Nemachena is going to present, the structure of that, especially from the breeding side, who are the main players in this whole sector? I think Dr. Nemachena is going to touch on that. What is the role of the private sector? What is the role of the public sector? And what are the risks associated with the involvement of each actor in the breeding, in the production, in the multiplication of the seed of sunflower? So I don't want to preempt what Dr. Nemachena is going to talk about, but I'm going to hand over to Dr. Nemachena to take us through the presentation and possibly engage us on how best we can learn from your research. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Nemachena.
Okay, thank you very much, colleague. Good afternoon, colleagues. As it has been mentioned, I'll be presenting on the evolving sunflower plant breeders' rights landscape in South Africa. And this is just the brief outline of the presentation that I'm going to be doing. There's been an increased investment in the private sector in the agriculture and seed industry, which has triggered a significant debate in terms of intellectual property rights and also in terms of improvement of yields and growth in agriculture. Several legislations have been put in place at a national level and also at an international level. And the protection of plants through intellectual property rights and plant breeders was recognized in the 19th century in countries like Chile. And the formation of the International Union for Protection of New Seed Varieties of Plants with the abbreviation UPOV. It was established in 1961, and it was established to coordinate plant variety protection laws and standardize protection across member countries. And plant variety protection allows exclusive protection of the granted plant-related innovations to breeders. In South Africa became the 10th member of UPOV in 1977. South Africa and Kenya and Zimbabwe are the members of some of the African members of UPOV. And UPOV has got around 50 member countries. And UPOV brings a standard on laws in terms of intellectual property rights and also of plant breeders' rights. It standardizes the procedure for testing of new varieties and promotes cooperation between member countries. This gives the UPOV members advantages and privileges for them to apply for protection in other member countries. This broadens the horizon of the breeders to have their varieties accessing licenses in other countries as well as attain royalties. The whole process, it gives the opportunity of a financial reward to the breeders, since breeding is an expensive and also a time-consuming process, it is important to develop new and improved plant varieties, as there is continuous demand for better quality, better yields, and also increased resistance to diseases. Plant breeders' rights are a form of intellectual property rights that are valid only in the country where they are applied on, especially under the group of members. And they can be they can be granted in different countries on the same varieties. Those who are, that means in those in countries who are a group of members and who follow the regulations. In South Africa, plant breeders' rights can be granted for 20 to 25 years, depending on the type of crop, of which sunflower is under the crops that are only issued protection for 20 years. Trees and other citrus fruits also are the ones who have a maximum of up to 25 years. So during the first 5 to 8 years after being given, after being granted plant breeders' rights, the breeder has got a sole right to enjoy the benefits of multiplying, selling their variety, and no one has got access to either propagated material or genetic material. But after the 5 years, the next 15 years, the holder is required to issue a license for those who might want to access their variety in terms of breed or genetic material or propagation. And if the holder refuses to issue a license, the registrar in the Department of Agriculture, Forestries and Fisheries has got the right to issue what is called a compulsory license. And during this term, the holder may continue to claim royalties from all licenses for propagating material and also selling it. It is only when the 20 or 25 years have expired, that's when the variety will be openly accessible to anyone who might need it. So the main objective of this study is to follow the changes in the plant breeders' rights over time, including the changing of ownership of rights, and also compare between the public and private sector, as well as also to what extent is the domestic sector involved and the foreign breeders involved in terms of plant variety protection in the sunflower industry. This will help to inform policy discussions and understand the evolution of varietal rights and the extent of varietal rights granted. Just a brief history of where sunflower comes from. It is a native wild crop from North America, which originates from the Fertile Crescents. And Europeans were exposed to sunflower through southern Canada and Mexico. Spain was the first gateway for sunflower to spread in Europe. And Russia was started with the first commercial production of sunflower. And the first hybrid of sunflower was released in 1972, which produced a 25% higher yield than the normal varieties. And also the release of short-stemmed and high-yield varieties enabled efficient mechanized cropping, resulting in sunflower being a major oil seed crop. Sunflower is the third most important crop after maize and wheat in South Africa, and it thrives very well under marginalized low input farming conditions. It is consistent in yields under hostile weather conditions. Given that South Africa is a water scarce country, it will thrive very well. And also it is drought tolerant, and it is a crop that is user friendly for dryland farmers. It also takes advantage of residual nitrogen and subsoil moisture that cannot be utilized by other crops. So it is a very useful crop in terms of crop rotation. The sunflower value chains is quite interesting and also broad. It is the main source of our cooking oil and also cake feed for animals. And it can be processed into our healthy granola bars, the multigrain bread, and also it can be roasted as snacks for those who do benting diet. And also it is used in margarine and bird food. It is also an alternative for peanut butter when it's processed into sun butter for those people who have got peanut allergies. And one of the most important things that is also being explored now, it can be, the sunflower can be converted into biodiesel, given that we also need to factor in sustainable renewable energies that are also environmentally friendly. And besides its use in the industrial, for industrial use, sunflower can also be used for dyes in the textile industry, and for body painting, and for hypoallergenic rubber and cosmetics. And the other parts of the plant can be used for skin and hair products for medicinal reasons. And it also is also gained mileage in being an ornamental flower as well. Sunflower is produced in 6 of the 9 provinces in South Africa, mainly in Free State, Northwest, and being followed by Limpopo, Mpumalanga, and Gauteng. Our data, the data that we used in this study was accessed from the plant variety journal that is planned by the Department of Agriculture, Forestries and Fisheries. They started publishing it in 1979, and we captured data for sunflower applications of plant breeders' rights, and also sunflower applications of the varieties to be included on the national variety list. So we captured data from 1979 to 2012. We had to capture it from hard copies that we accessed from the Department of Agriculture, Forestries and Fisheries. And further information that we captured, we had to capture the variety names of the sunflowers that were registered under the national variety list, and also for application of plant breeders' rights. And we had to also capture the applicant names, which are the breeders, and also maybe the collaborators of, or if it's a foreign company, we had to capture the foreign company and also their local collaborators, and also the date of applications of the plant breeders' rights. Our analysis was basically descriptive and trend analysis. This is just to give you just a background of the area of production and also productivity for the sunflower production in South Africa for the period of 1936 to 2018 seasons. It is quite a fluctuating structure of on the productivity of sunflower. Okay, these are the annual applications for sunflower varietal improvements for the period of 1979 to 2019. As you can see from the graph that the first application was in 1979 with 2 varieties, and 1981 with only 1 application. Later, there was no application from 1981 to 2001. Then we started having an increase in the applications for protection on plant breeders' rights. This could be that mainly breeders were only applying to be included on the national variety list, because the national variety list, it allows you to be listed as one of the commercial varieties. So mainly breeders didn't apply for protection of their varieties. But later on, we can see an increase up to almost 18 varieties in 2008, and also in 2016 with 14 applications on plant breeders' rights. Then these are the plant breeders' rights that were granted to breeders for the protection of their sunflower varieties. As we can see, the first plant breeders' rights for sunflower were granted in 1995 from the first application in 1979, which is a bit of a worrying thing, given that when a breeder maybe someone has applied in 1979, now the granting only starts in 1995. It affects innovation of breeders, given that the longer period that they have to wait for them to get protection on their varieties. But later, starting from 2002, from our calculations, still within the period, the average period for application for you to get granted plant breeders' rights is still around 365 days, which is also still a bit worrying for breeders to, it's quite a long time for someone who will have had their innovations and they'll have to wait for such a long period. And this is this graph shows the annual applications for inclusion of sunflower varieties on the national variety list. As I mentioned earlier, that this allows you to, before you commercialize your seed, it has to be registered under the national variety list. And also the applications started in 1980, and the highest number is recorded in 1991, where over 35 varieties breeders had to apply for the inclusion on the national variety list. And these are the applicants, the main applicants that applied for inclusion on the national variety list. There are other players, but the main players are PANA. So over the period of 1979 to 2019, PANA has got the highest number of 102 varieties, which constituted of almost 23%, 23.8% of the overall applicants. And then Pioneer Seeds with 51 varieties, of Safola Seed with 42 varieties, and the public sector, agriculture, represented by the Agriculture Research Council. Over this period, it has only applied for inclusion of their seed sunflower varieties for only 10 varieties, which constitutes about 2.3%. Okay, this pie chart just represents the groups that we tried to group our types of applicants on the national variety, on the inclusion of varieties on the national variety list. We classified them as foreign public. Those are the foreign companies that are outside South Africa that seek to apply for commercialization of their seeds in South Africa. And the local companies, the likes of PANA, and the local companies and foreign public companies. This is when they do a collaboration for applications of the varieties on the national variety list in South Africa, and also the local public, which is mainly represented by the Agricultural Research Council. The local private sector constituted, when we have added all the local private players, they constituted around 77% for the inclusion on the national variety list. And the foreign, the collaboration between the foreign companies and the local companies, they constituted about 19%. And partnership, this is an indication of partnerships being formed with local companies and foreign companies. These companies include Syngenta. The foreign companies include Syngenta USA, Syngenta France, Pioneer Hybrid USA, Dogro Sciences in Argentina, and Bioseed in the USA. In South Africa, the sunflower industry, the public sector being represented by the Agricultural Research Council, only constituted about 1% of the overall share on the inclusion of the varieties on the national variety list. In the application of variety inclusion, the national variety list shows less activity of the public sector in terms of sunflower production. So what is the future of the sunflower industry in South Africa? The Agricultural Research Council is also exploring the use of crop breeding to produce advanced biodiesel, and also the various crops that we identified for biodiesel and renewable diesel production include sunflower, soybeans, and canola. And given that sunflower, because it can thrive under marginal conditions, it will be a conducive plant crop to be used for renewable energy production. So the ARC seeks to also exploit the selected cultivars for sunflower production to meet the requirements of renewable diesel. And also sunflower, canola, and soybeans have still continue to be proposed to be the proposed crops for biodiesel production in the country. Because of we are in need of eco-friendly renewable energy, still plant oils are still recommended to be the ones to be used for renewable, eco-friendly renewable energy. And the success of the sunflower dependent industry depends on the success and level of innovation in the release and registration of new sunflower varieties in South Africa. Hybrid varieties are more productive to meet the ever-growing demand for the renewable energy sector. So we would require a more efficient breeding program, an efficient variety registration process, which is shorter and efficient in the granting of plant breeders' rights, so that we protect our breeders with innovations to ensure a long-term and sustainable sector. So in summary, our study addressed the absence of empirical evidence on the patterns of trends of sunflower varietal improvement in South Africa. And the study provides evidence of the evolution of varietal rights and the extent of varietal rights granted with sunflower varieties which were included in the national variety list, and also that which the breeders said to apply for plant variety protection in the form of plant breeders' rights. The current structure is mainly dominated by the private sector, and there is need to support the public breeding sector to mitigate the risk in the event of the private sector changing focus or pulling out in the economy for the production and breeding of sunflower seed varieties. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you so much to the two presenters on such a very interesting topic. For me, what I found really interesting in this study is how much sunflower is used widely for different types of crops, not just for making cooking oil. And it is also interesting that the ARC is also involved in the production of biofuel, biodiesel using sunflower seeds. At a personal research level, I think that the structure and conduct of the industry could be very helpful in trying to understand the extent to which we could include or involve or encourage emerging Black farmers in entering this industry in terms of what the barriers are to entry. For example, how much land could be used to cultivate, how many tons of a sunflower, how much would be the investments in terms of sunk costs that emerging farmers would need to enter into this industry. And I think understanding those types of variables and dynamics is probably going to be very important in how we address some of the problems or challenges in the land redistribution program of the land reform project as a whole. So yeah, so for me, just reflecting on the study, I thought those were some of the interesting points, some of them coming out directly and some of them that could be extrapolated and linked for further research. On that note, could I please ask Professor Aliba to come forward and yes, present his response to the presentation and study. Professor Aliba?
Okay, thank you. Here we are. Thanks very much for the opportunity, and thank you. Yeah, it was really lovely to read the paper and listen to the presentation and to have this chance to discuss it. Can I just ask, are people seeing the slides, the PowerPoint? Okay. So, I mean, my job's pretty straightforward, I think. Let me just start with some general comments and then a few observations. So, my general comments are these: that it's an interesting, important, and important topic, and pleasingly specific. You know, I'd sometimes personally get lost in general discussions of this and that. It was nice to sort of grapple with something as specific as sunflower plant breeding rights and so forth. I also found it very nice that there was this use of an unusual data set. It's not a data set that I'd ever come across before or seen an analysis of. And it's definitely shows that with a bit of resourcefulness, you know, we can expand the envelope of knowledge by looking for useful information where it exists. I also like the manner in which the analysis was historically grounded. Also looked at the consumer side of things, what sunflowers are used for, as Prof. Mbata alluded to. And it may have come out a bit less in the presentation than in the paper I read, but useful comparisons of patterns of plant breeding rights in South Africa as compared to other countries and in respect of other crops. Okay, now, since I started with some positive comments, you might be thinking I'm about to turn on the negativity. Not at all, but I am going to ask a lot of questions, and it could be reflecting my ignorance about the topic, but also they can be taken as possible suggestions for further research. So one thing that struck me about the paper and about the presentation was that it isn't really focused primarily on plant breeding rights. It's largely that, but it's also about this animal called the National Variety List and applications to be included on the National Variety List. And yes, in terms of the data presented and so forth, there was, I would say, almost equal focus on the latter. But for me personally, I'm not entirely clear on what the relationship is between plant breeding rights on the one hand and the National Variety List on the other. And perhaps it's an area that could be further, not just explained, but explored, because seemingly there's something interesting going on. I'll get to some of the figures in a moment that I pulled out of the paper, but yeah, quite interesting. As far as I can make out, and I think Dr. Nemechena did allude to this, companies apply to have their varieties included on the variety list in order to commercialize. In other words, it seems to be a measure to protect consumers, i.e. farmers, but I'm not absolutely clear about that. And there was a comment in the paper about how the delays in registering people's varieties on the list can be problematic for breeders because it denies them the opportunity or postpones for them the opportunity to start to earn money out of their varieties, which is very similar to the argument we make about why we need intellectual property rights in the form of plant breeding rights. So what the question in my mind is, well, which is the more problematic at the moment? Is it the paucity of applications for plant breeding rights and or the slowness in the adjudication of those applications, or is it the failure to register applications to be on the variety list more promptly? And I'm not clear about that. But something seems to be, there's something latent there that we should be learning about in terms of understanding the economics of plant breeding in South Africa. And I think we need to push it a little further. Just a statistic pulled out of the paper. Over this period in question, 76 applications for plant breeding rights versus 429 applications to be on the new variety list. Now, I could just be flaunting my ignorance, but I don't really understand the magnitude of this gap between these two numbers. So I'm wondering, is it that seed companies are seeking to list varieties that were developed before plant breeding rights in South Africa was a possibility? Are these varieties mainly developed overseas and people just want to get them, start selling them in South Africa? Therefore, they didn't need to worry about the plant breeding rights because that's happened somewhere else. They just want to start selling in South Africa. Or is it maybe the case that breeders don't see breeding rights as an economic necessity nearly to the extent that they see the registration of their of the varieties on the list? Well, so what we don't really know is that 76 PBR applications, does that give us an accurate idea of how many new varieties were actually developed in this period? Or were there many more developed, but there were no breeding rights sought for them? So, you know, there's I think a lot more we need to understand to get to the bottom of it. The paper posits the general theme of evolution, and I love stories about how things change over time, because I think change over time gives us a lot of insight as to the underlying mechanics, the underlying questions, and ultimately the policy, the underlying policy issues. And of course, we are presented with those striking graphs showing the numbers of applications over time of the two types, the PBR and the NVL. But I think there's a lot more one would want to know about this evolution over time. So one is, to the extent the paper foregrounds the importance of the balance between public and private, has that changed over time in terms of the respective numbers of applications? What about foreign versus local? So these are also things that maybe they remain in proportion over time, but maybe there's some discernible shift one way or another that could be revealing. We don't know much about what sorts of innovations are implied in the new varieties. Are they moving towards pest resistance, yield, drought tolerance? Is it in order to fit specific geographical niches? So it'd be nice to know if there are any particular trends in that over time. And then one thing we also would like to know is, you know, it seems that roughly half, maybe fewer than half of the PBR applications were ultimately approved. Is that just because of they haven't been approved yet, or they were actually rejected, i.e. denied? And then what is the pattern of that over time? And what's the rationale for rejecting or not processing applications? And what could we learn from that if we were to focus on it? And then, you know, I'd be personally curious to know what happened around 2007 when that spike started in applications for plant breeding rights. Sorry, I'm forgetting now if it was plant breeding rights or new variety list registrations, but I think it was the plant breeding rights. And then lastly, I just want to touch on the underlying question of public policy. So sunflower is an interesting crop. I must say I was unaware of the fact that it's the third most important crop in South Africa. You'd think, given how, you know, bright those flowers are, we'd be more aware of it driving around. Maybe it's because I live in the wrong province. Now, it isn't really spelled out in the paper, but the emphasis on its drought tolerance and so forth, to me, it makes it sound like potentially it's an ideal crop for smallholders, emerging farmers, those in the emerging farming sector, those who have relatively little access to irrigation, even irrigable land, often living in marginal environments. But that's not the theme that really comes out. But it does suggest that perhaps to the extent the state has a say in who's granted breeding rights, and also the extent to which the state participates in breeding programs, you know, whether there's an underlying public policy logic to that. Is it in order, for example, to make sunflower, you know, to bring it into, you know, make it a more viable crop for small scale farmers? The emphasis on productivity, I mean, what we know from varietal changes broadly, especially in respect of GM crops, is that they tend not to be friendly to small scale farmers. And in fact, they tend to move in the direction of intensive production systems using huge amounts of capital and so forth. And of course, that's tied in with the logic of why smallholders tend to fall by the wayside when modern varieties are developed and commercialized. So these are things I think one would want to know more about. To the extent the paper does talk a lot about the balance between public and private, I would think that that underlying public purpose should, has to come out a little more clearly. Yeah, so that's about it. I just want to thank you again for the opportunity, and yeah, I'm all ears.
Great, thank you. I wonder if everybody can see me, hear me. You can just nod. Dr. Nemachema, okay, fantastic. Okay, thank you so much, Prof. Aliba, for the response. Sort of like giving us questions that are contributing towards us finding the pieces of the puzzle that are completing or contribute towards giving us the more complete picture of the sector. So maybe I would like to just say that we also invited representatives from the industry themselves, and some of them could probably also contribute to some of the questions that are being asked in these research questions. And maybe also before opening up for audience, general audience comments and questions in the Q&A box. And please, colleagues, put your questions not in the chat box, but in the Q&A box there. I see some of the questions are coming up. I would like to ask both Dr. Muchera and Nechatema to maybe respond to some of the questions that you can readily find answers to from the response from Professor Aliba. Over to you, Dr. Muchera and Dr. Nemachena.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Aliba, for the comments. I will start by explaining the issue of inclusion on the national variety list. You cannot apply for plant breeders' rights when you are not listed on the national variety list. So it is very critical for you as a breeder to be listed on the national variety list. As I mentioned before, that this list allows you to commercialize your seeds, your variety in South Africa. So before you commercialize, you have to be listed on the national variety list. Then you can further go on to apply for plant breeders' rights. But the challenge, it looks like most breeders and most seed companies were not interested in further application for plant breeder, for the protection of plant breeders' rights, which is a bit concerning though, because in terms of wheat, in the wheat sector, the number of varieties that have applied for plant breeders' rights is quite competitive together with that on those that have applied to be on the national variety list as well. And also with the issue of that you have raised a concern on when the application was done in 1979, but later only the first approved granting was done in 1995. There's quite a whole lot of requirements that is needed from the breeders before they get the plant breeders' rights are granted, which includes that their varieties have to meet the requirements, especially the issues of is it a different variety from any other variety that might be commercially produced in South Africa. And also they have to also produce some seeds that are supposed to be kept in the gene bank at ARC. So there's a quite whole lot of list of requirements. So if those requirements are not met, it actually delays the application of plant breeders' rights to be issued on a variety. So I guess the tediousness in the process also is the one that is also limiting for breeders not to apply for plant breeders' rights, but which is quite also concerning because it's a different issue with maize and wheat. I think for now, maybe Dr. Mchara might want to come in with the other responses.
Yes, thank you very much. And thanks, Prof. Prof. Aliba. You have actually given us some real practical issues to look at. And I want to concede that in terms of application of our study into the relevance of smallholder farmers, which are key into South Africa, it's a bit weak. And you have clearly highlighted the significance of actually linking our research into smallholder agriculture. I want to start by tackling the issue of the economics of plant breeding. And it is very important because the economics actually surround, besides the profitability of the business, but also the interlinkages that actually takes place from proper breeding and the innovation that goes into producing new varieties, productivity issues, and the ultimate value chains that benefit out of that production. So that's where the whole economics is. And if we manage well the innovation and supporting the breeder, then it automatically means that we are more likely to have a much more sustainable value chain and more sustainable sector in the long run. And in terms of the smallholder, yeah, that's a very key. That's a very key element. And I think the sunflowers have always been looked at from a commercial perspective. And as to how we can actually balance the food security issue, we know our smallholder farmers, in most cases, they produce some of them for food security purposes and not entirely for commercial. There is a very fine balance in terms of balancing the immediate food requirements and the commercial part, possibly at a 20-80 for food security, and then the little surplus 20% towards commercial to supplement their household income. But maybe if we can go further and do a research to see if a farmer, a smallholder farmer, entirely dedicates part of his land, or bulk of his land on sunflower, to what extent can we basically change their livelihoods if they can derive more income out of it and then convert that income into buying some other foodstuffs? Will that be a sustainable equation in terms of sustaining a smallholder farmer? But in terms of climate, linking the smallholder farmer and the attributes of sunflower to handle adverse weather conditions and its ability to sustain dry weather conditions, I think definitely because of shortage of irrigation in the country, it's actually a good crop to consider. That's what I can comment from my side. But otherwise, thank you very much for those comments. I think they actually resonate well in terms of developing proper policies. And even when I checked on some of the comments that are coming in, there is a specific question that looks at the profit margins per hectare of sunflower. We did not really look much into the gross margins and the enterprise budgets because the objective was not entirely to look at the profitability, but in terms of driving the sustainability from a breeding perspective. But that is one thing that can also be considered, actually, to actually bring out a paper that can actually justify why some of the farmers can actually go to this crop in terms of profitability, in terms of operationalizing the whole enterprise. And I see also from Kenneth.
Maybe we should just let them read themselves, Dr. Muchara, or sort of like bring them forward to ask the questions themselves, you see.
Okay.
So yeah, so maybe firstly I'm just going to go on the sequence in which the questions did come. So maybe we should ask first Jamie Alexandra, who also put a question on the chat box, maybe because that was the first question that I saw as we jump over to sort of like interacting with everybody in the audience. So, and then we can all as panelists maybe respond to the questions one by one as they come. So, I mean, at the moment, we've got about 4 questions, and I think we can handle those 4 questions if we bring the members of the audience to the fore to ask the questions. So I'll start off with Jamie Alexandra. Can we please bring Jamie Alexandra forth, and so she can present the question herself or comment?
Thank you so much, Prof. I haven't been so excited about sunflowers before. It's really made me think this paper. I'm just thinking that there's so much, there's so many ways that small scale and subsistence farmers are promoted when it comes to the protection of heritage seeds and seed varieties elsewhere in the world, but it doesn't seem to really be happening in South Africa. And I wonder how the state can really get involved in really supporting that so that people are actually able to be key players. I think there's quite a lot of programs to learn from elsewhere in the world. So it just really makes me think. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you for that comment. Yeah, so I'm very much also interested in, the paper also mentions how limited the extent to which the government itself is contributing in the applications or registrations of new varieties, and why that is the case and why is it mostly private sector driven. Is there any comment from your side, Dr. Charity, or even an answer if you, any response from your side?
Not that much. I can only say that I'm happy to hear that people are gaining interest in the sunflower. It looks like people we underlooked it as a crop. I think they'll just look at the flowers and not think much about it as well. But I think the point that I'm getting is it's something that should be really considered for the smallholder farmers, given its ability to thrive under marginal conditions, of which with smallholder farmers, I think we would need something that is not complicated or that is also that also has a minimal cost in producing as well.
Just lessons around the use of sunflower seeds in biofuels. At the moment, it looks like it's public sector driven from the research to the ARC. I don't know what the trends are internationally and what South Africa could learn as well, just linked up to that question from Jamie Alexandra. I'm going to move on to Thomas Salmon. Are we able to bring Thomas on to sort of like engage with a question or comment?
Good afternoon. Thank you to the panelists for the fantastic presentation and incredibly targeted and focused. The question I wanted to ask was just in regards to the jump that you mentioned in the in the discussion, the jump in applications between 2007, 2008, and then 2015 and 2016, what might have prompted that, and just about profit margins per hectare and the main inputs possibly for sunflower farming.
Yeah, so thank you, Thomas, for that. And I was actually thinking myself, was this related to the drought in 2015, 2016, when I was reading the paper and listening to the presentation? Was it related to the economic meltdown in 2008? I wonder what the thoughts are from the presenters themselves, whether they thought about this spike at those particular two periods and what they could have been, where they could have been coming from.
Okay, on the part of the 2015, 2016, it looks like Pana is the one that had the highest number of varieties during that time. It could have been the explanation of that drought around this period as well. But I also didn't make much efforts to ask the people from the registrar, why will it have been that way? But from the look of things, it looks like Pana is the one that had the highest number of those varieties around this period.
Okay. The next audience member to ask a number of questions. Can we please bring forth Kenneth Nundu. I think I've got that right. Maybe we can engage each question at a time. So ask each question or comment at a time, and then allow the panel members to respond to as such.
Okay, thanks, Prof. And thanks to the presenters as well for such insights into sunflower and the industry, and as well as Prof. Alipa in terms of his response, which also brought in new insights in terms of this presentation. So I think I have about 3 or 4 questions. The first one that I want to check with the presenters is, it's actually based on, there was a slide that was on annual applications, and you could see that there was a period, say, before 1994 versus post 1994 when the new government came in. So you could actually see there are interesting trends that could come, out of that, in the sense that before 1994, on average, it looks like they were higher, PBR applications versus the period beyond 1994. So do you perhaps have interesting insights in terms of what could have happened that before we had higher applications than after 1994? Was it because of policy shifts, or like what are really the emerging issues out of that landscape?
Okay, thank you very much, Kenneth, for the question. In terms of sunflower, it looks like they were the highest number pre-1994. I think basically maybe there was more of the release of the seed pre-1994. But at the same time, if you compare with the other crops, you can actually see that there is more applications after 1994 in terms of wheat and maize. So post 1994, there could be many other reasons, including the issues of liberalization of the agricultural market and issues of governing control boards and everything. So that could have affected also the post 1994 application era as well.
Okay, thanks. Actually, you came in terms of my second question, because I was also going to say, okay, we actually have 2 landscapes. The one, the 1994, soon after the new government came in, maybe in terms of whether there were policy shifts and all those kind of issues. But then I was also looking at the other landscape that you explained, the issue of deregulation, to say, the period before deregulation, things were like this. Then after deregulation, the landscape, apparently it changed. So maybe that leads me to my last question, which talks to the fact that after deregulation, then the sunflower industry was not really protected, So whatever activities that that were happening within the industry in terms of the issues that we are talking about here, they were actually, most of those were actually dependent on international market dynamics, and the like, especially in terms of issues of pricing, where the exchange rate determined what prices the sunflower producers could get. So perhaps, do you think that could also have an influence in terms of the breeding side, in terms of the plant breeding rights, and this is over and above what Prof. Alipa also alluded to, in terms of registration delays. So what could be your comment, perhaps based on what happens on the international market? Does it have an influence in terms of what is happening in the sunflower industry?
On that one, I'm not very sure, but what I would want to say in terms of the issues of deregulation, it looks like it shifted. It's sort of like shaped quite a number of crop industries as well after the deregulation of many control boards. And also, since there is also an issue of an international market, maybe the issues of exchange rate and all might have also affected this era as well.
Thank you.
Okay, there's one that just out of interest, we see private sector domination, in the plant breeders' rights, and what could be a policy imperative, in terms of trying to bring in the public sector, participation in this, or perhaps do you think there is maybe the issues of investments into research and development for sunflower, the pressures of the fiscus could also have an effect, in terms of, the public sector not, not participating quite well compared to the private sector. Do you think there are any implications from the fiscal side?
Yeah, there is a lot, because the challenge that we are having after the deregulation of the agricultural industry, we have seen that funding also to the ARC has also decreased a lot. And also there's a big challenge with the infrastructure at ARC that fine, they can breed their own varieties, but they don't have the multiplication capacity. They have to also take their varieties to the private sector, which is also quite of a dangerous issue in terms of this minimum involvement of the public sector. They can be involved to an extent, so which also poses a danger to these to the breeding industry in terms of our sunflower, wheat, and maize as well, that in the event of the public sector deciding to withdraw out of the breeding industry, it becomes also a big concern to the food security situation in South Africa.
All right, I'm going to have to just hold it there. Thank you so much for the questions and comments and responses from, are there any responses specifically to these questions from other members of the panel? Any thoughts, Dr. Muchara, Professor Michael, before I move on to the next phase?
Can I come in when it comes to the issue of the deregulation of the market? And I think Dr. Nemachena actually handled it well to say the deregulation definitely had an impact in terms of new applications and actually bringing in a new sense of growth in the sector. Because once the sector was deregulated, it meant that's why the private sector were much more interested, because there was now more agility and they could now penetrate much better markets. They can now compete and all that. I think that was the other driver for private sector to be interested in the sunflower sector. But definitely there is room for the public sector to actually get involved. As Dr. Nemachena said, the multiplication of the seed, the ISERs, it's very important. At least if we can be able to increase the contribution of the public sector into that breeding space, it really secures us as a country into that sector. As most private companies, they put their money where their interests are. The sunflower market might not be performing well and they could de-invest in that sector. So we should at least have a certain percentage that is significant, much higher than the current 2.3% contribution. So if we can be able to increase that, then possibly we can be able to secure ourselves so that we don't entirely rely on the private sector for such an important market. And when we are looking at the international market, let's not just look at the international market for sunflower per se, but let's look at it from the products that comes out of the sunflower. It could be the price of the oils that comes out of that. they could be the drivers as to people, as to investors willing to invest in the sunflower, because the products and some of the byproducts that come out of that plant is actually much more beneficial and makes economic sense to invest in the sector. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. I see Prof. Michael, if you wanted to say something, you can unmute. You're fine? Okay, fantastic. All right. Colleagues, thank you so much. I see Jamie also posted what might be an interesting paper against the odds smallholder farmers in agricultural biodiversity. Do you want to comment on that paper and maybe how it could be useful for this kind of discussion? Jamie?
Thanks, Prof. It's just thoughts that these two things haven't really been brought together.
Okay.
What I can see is things happening only in a broad commercial sector and other things happening in kind of an NGO or smaller interested parties. And it's something that is happening elsewhere in Africa. So in many cases, we are behind. So there's, for example, small scale subsistence farmers who form quite a large part of growing commercial flower seed for export in other countries. And it's a well-supported and very successful program. So I think we have a lot to look across the continent at to get inspiration from. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. All right, I'm going to go around the table for last comments, if any, and I'm going to start up again with Professor Aliba and then Dr. Muchara and then Dr. Charity before I close off this session. Do you want to say anything? Just in closing. Prof. Aliba, you can unmute the mic.
Sorry,
Sure.
just missing the button. Thanks. Well, I really don't want to say much. Just thanks again for the opportunity. On a slightly more substantive note, yeah, I think going back to Dr. Nundu's question about, how do we explain the apparent underinvestment of the public sector? Maybe we have to take a step back and ask, well, what's the rationale for the public sector competing in this breeding sphere? And I think possibly there are some very good arguments, but we need to make them. We need to elucidate them. Thank you.
Sure. Dr. Muchara and then Dr. Charity. Do you want to unmute? If you are talking, Dr. Muchara, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you very much. I think we have had some very interesting pointers to actually influence our next paper. The role of the sunflower plant to the smallholder farmers and the role of the public sector. How best can we be able to develop that further? Thank you very much for all the comments.
Sure. Lastly, Doctor, please, give us the last comment and then we close. Dr. Charity.
Thank you very much, Prof. Mata, and also colleagues, thank you very much for coming to the webinar. I don't think I've got much to say, but also thank you for all the questions and the contributions that will incite us for areas of further research.
Sure, thank you. Colleagues, that brings us to what's the closing of this session. Thank you for joining us, everybody who's joined us. We had more than 30 participants in this discussion, which is great. You will find the recording of the webinar on our ISER YouTube channel, as I said earlier on, where more comments and questions would also be welcome and would be responded to. I would also want to thank you for taking the time to join us, and also thank you for joining us in advance for our future seminars. We also thank the people who asked the questions and made the comments and all the contributions. Please feel free to request information for us for further collaborations. I would like to thank our presenters, of course, and our generous respondent for such a great display of effort, and also thank the whole ISER team for putting together another important seminar. you can always contact our very efficient administrator, Mr. Bulelani, on his email address that I showed on the slides earlier on. And on that note, have a great afternoon further, and thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Thanks, everybody. Cheers.